All right, so we are glad that you have all come today for our webinar on accuracy, quality, and the 2020 census. And I'm Wendy Underhill. I'm the Director of Elections and Redistricting at the National Conference of State Legislatures. And I vie with my colleague, Christy Zamarripa, for the name of Census Geek Extraordinaire at NCSL. I will say that once you get outside of the NCSL world, we're not Census Geeks Extraordinaire. Some of you all are, certainly Terry, and that fits for you. We are often talking about census in regard to how it works for redistricting. In this case, though, that's not the case. We're talking about it as it works for policy people. But the folks we have with us will be able to handle any questions you might have, I'm fairly sure. So I wanted to start with a story. Last week, I was in Minnesota, and I was at a conference about election accuracy and how the nation can improve the accuracy of its elections. So some of you know that in the elections world, one vote can make a huge difference. There are plenty of races that are decided by one vote. So the goal for election people is to count every single vote as it was cast, counted accurately. And basically that is that they want to be able to show their work and they want to be very close to perfection. So I'm walking down the hall and I'm thinking about perfection and I'm thinking about how perfect this all is. And then I walk right into the men's room. Well, I can blame that on the signage there, or I could blame it on distractions, who knows, but there you go. Very right in my face, you're thinking perfection and you do not have perfection. Nobody's got perfection. Nobody and nothing is perfect. So that was my thought about for today's conversation. We're looking at the goal of the decennial census, and the goal is to count every person in the United States, count them just once and count them in the right place. And if we could do that, we'd have a perfect snapshot of the US population. Well, the people at the US Census Bureau know full well that that is never going to be possible, hasn't ever been possible, and won't be possible in the future. But they do aim for it. And at the same time, the data users of the nation are also thinking about how good is this data? How close to perfection is it? Well, since it can't be perfect, then the question is, how do you judge how far off of perfect it is? And that's kind of where we come in today. For the folks who are here, policymakers, as well as redistrictor type people, the question is, how do we know if those numbers are satisfactory for our use cases? And we've brought in some excellent folks to talk about this. And we're going to start with Tim Kennel. He is the Assistant Division Chief for Statistical Methods at the US Census Bureau. And he will be followed up by Teresa Sullivan. And she is the chair of the National Academy of Sciences panel to evaluate the quality of the 2020 census. The fact I had to look over there for the title of the panel is a little bit amusing because I'm also a member of that panel. And then we'll hear from Dr. William O'Hare, known primarily as Bill O'Hare. He's the president of his own demographic service company, but for many years he ran the Kids Count program for the NEEKC Foundation. So he's known, I'd say, for many different things, but one of them is about undercounts and particularly children. So to all my faculty, I want to thank you very much. For those who've signed in, I want to thank you as well. I think you can go ahead and start to put questions in the chat box if there's something you know. Again, we were thinking primarily about quality of the data, but if you've got something else, these folks are steeped in this. So if you want to talk about processes or any other part of the census, I'm pretty sure they can field any question you might have. Tim, are you ready to start? And if so, would you please start with telling us a little bit about the first census where you kind of became aware there was a census, personal or professional?
Yeah, well, the 2020 census is really my first one here. I started at the Census Bureau in 2000 or shortly thereafter, and worked on current surveys. And I'm very happy to have started on the American Community Survey. So we have the long form still in 2020, and we're bridging towards this American Community Survey. And I had a lot of fun working on making sure we had a good frame and it had good coverage. So that was sort of my beginning, I guess, in sort of 2000-ish with the long form ACS, but really, in terms of measuring coverage and working on the decennial census, this is my first time with 2020.
Well, Tim, I love the fact that you used fun and census in the same sentence. And I think you are on the right call because a lot of other people here find some fun in working on census stuff too. All right, take it away.
All right, so I think Christy is going to share some slides. Okay, today I have the honor of providing results from the most interesting survey in the world, the Post-Enumeration Survey, which I will refer to as the PES. Next slide. This presentation has three main parts. In the first part, I will introduce some of the key concepts of coverage measurement. I hope to answer questions like, what is net coverage? What is gross coverage? What are omissions? How do we estimate coverage? In the second part, I will take a few remarks about the future releases from the Post-Enumeration Survey. And then in the last section, I'll mention a few highlights from the coverage report released in March. Next slide. So what is coverage? Next slide. The definition of the estimated net coverage error is here. In the numerator, we see the difference between the census count and an estimated count. The Post-Enumeration Survey uses dual system estimation to determine the size of the population. We call this the PES estimate, the dual system estimate, or the population estimate. The estimate is compared to the census count for the same universe using the formula shown here. The estimated net coverage error rate is the difference between the census and the PES estimate relative to the size of the PES estimate. If the number is negative, the census was less than the estimated population size, and we call this an undercount. If the number is positive, the census was too high, and we call that an overcount. And a number close to zero means the census count was about right. Dual system estimation is not the only way to estimate the population size. Demographic analysis uses administrative records to estimate the population size. Next slide. To illustrate the relationship between net coverage error and gross coverage errors, I'll walk through this table, which was part of the March release of the PES estimates. Next slide. The top section of this table shows the components of census coverage. Through independent interviews and follow-up, the PES is able to estimate which records in the census were correct enumerations, erroneous enumerations, and whole person census imputations, which we don't have enough information to call correct or erroneous. Next slide. The PES generally defines a correct enumeration as a record that refers to an in-scope person. The person must be unique, and we must have complete information about that person. Next slide. Erroneous enumerations include duplicates, as well as people who were counted but should not have been. For example, they might have died before April 1st, 2020, or were just visiting the country. There were about 7 million erroneous enumerations, most of which were duplicates. Next slide. For some records in the census, we didn't receive a response with enough characteristics, so we used a statistical technique called whole person imputation to fill in the blanks. There were about 11 million whole person census imputations in the census. About 9 million of these whole person census imputations were in households where a respondent reported a count for the household, but we didn't get sufficient characteristics about the person and had to impute all of their characteristics. Next slide. If you add up the 305 million correct enumerations, the 7 million erroneous enumerations, and the 11 million whole person census imputations, you'll get the census count of 323 million at the top of this table. The census count of 323 million is for the PES universe, which excludes people living in group quarters and remote Alaska areas. Next slide. In addition to dividing the census into the three components of coverage, the PES also estimates the population size. The 2020 PES estimate of the population size was 323.9 million people, as shown in the middle of this page. If we compare the PES estimate to the population size to the census count at the top, we see the census count was about 782,000 people less than the PES estimate. However, because the PES estimate is subject to sampling error, we can't say with certainty that the census count was above or below the PES estimate. Next slide. Now, 2 slides ago, I walked through the 3 components of census coverage. We can also divide the PES estimate of the country into components. There were two components of the PES estimate. We have the people who we have confirmed were counted in the census, and then those who were either missed or we couldn't determine if they were correctly counted in the census. The correct enumerations category has the exact same number that we saw earlier in the census count. Everyone else in the population is called an omission. It's important to note that some of the people who we call omissions were actually counted in the census. We just don't have enough evidence to support calling them correct enumerations. The PES uses a very strict definition of correct enumeration that includes checks to make sure the census enumeration corresponds to a unique person in the population. Next slide. Although the number of correct enumerations is the same for the components of census and the PES estimate, the rates are different because the denominators are different. The correct enumeration rate for the components of coverage is the 305 million correct enumerations divided by the census count. The correct enumeration rate for the components of the PES estimate is the 305 million correct enumerations divided by the PES estimate. So when we're talking about omissions and erroneous enumerations, we need to make sure we get a common denominator if we're wanting to, talk about the two rates on the same platform. Next slide. The estimated number of people in the population who we don't have strong evidence as being correctly enumerated in the census are called omissions. The PES could not prove that the remaining 18.8 million people were counted in the census correctly. Many of them probably were included in the census, but we don't have enough information to follow up on them and confirm that the enumeration was correct or erroneous. Let me give you an example to illustrate what I mean when I say some omissions were included in the census count. Consider a household of 3 people who responded to the census saying that there were 3 people in the household, but don't respond with any other information. The census doesn't collect their names or ages or sex or race or tenure. The census only learns that 3 people live in the household. This household is called a population count only household because they only provided a count of the number of people in the household. These 3 people are included in the census count as whole person census imputations. In March, I reported that about 9 million of the 11 million whole person census imputations were in households for which we knew the population count, but didn't have their name or other characteristics. When we conduct the PES, we seek to independently roster the people in the household. But if we don't have the names of the corresponding people in the census, we can't confirm that the people in the PES roster really were the same as the people reported in the census. Thus, these people are called omissions, even though they were included in the census count. We just don't have enough information to confirm whether they were correct or erroneous enumerations. Next slide. I'm not an expert on demographic analysis, but I did want to mention that the Census Bureau also uses demographic analysis to estimate the net coverage error. Demographic analysis relies on administrative records such as birth records and death records rather than a survey. To estimate the population size, they add up the birth records, subtract the number of people who have died, and then add estimates of immigration and subtract estimates of immigration. Next slide. Unlike demographic analysis, the Post-Enumeration Survey relies on survey interviews. Within a sample of blocks, the PES conducted a mini census that was independent of the 2020 census. The PES data was then matched to the census and combined with the census to create an estimate of the population size that's better than either the census could do on its own or the PES could do on its own. Next slide. This slide captures some of the complexity and work done to measure census coverage. To create coverage estimates, we conducted 5 field operations using very different questionnaires and instruments over more than 2 years. And we performed 3 large clerical matching phases. I'm truly indebted to the PES respondents, interviewers, and clerical matching staff. Without their hard work and dedication, I would not be here to talk about the Post-Enumeration Survey. Next slide. Although both demographic analysis and the PES provide independent estimates of the population size, they differ in who is counted in scope. So one of the primary differences is that the Post-Enumeration Survey excludes people living in remote Alaska areas and group quarters, such as college dorms, nursing homes, and prisons, while demographic analysis includes both groups. In this slide, we see that the 2020 census counts for the demographic analysis and the PES universes. The bottom row of the table shows the estimated population size from the DA and the PES. Next slide. Rather than releasing the PES reports all at once, we're releasing the coverage tables as they're available. Next slide. Here are the demographic characteristics we released on March 10th. Slide. We will have 2 more releases. The first release will be in May. It will contain estimates of net coverage error rates and components of coverage rates for each state and DC. Consistent with the 2010 reports, we do not plan to release any tables breaking down coverage by demographic characteristics within states. The May release will also include components of coverage for a variety of census operations. Later in the summer, we'll be releasing 2 more coverage reports. One will focus on the coverage of housing units, and the other in the summer release will include person and housing unit coverage in Puerto Rico. Next slide. So here's a quick summary of some of the findings we shared in May. More details and coverage tables can be found in the Census Bureau's press release on March 10th, 2 blogs supporting that release, and a report on the Census Bureau's coverage measurement webpage. Next slide. This graph shows the estimated net coverage error for the past 4 censuses. The vertical lines or towers at the end of each bar show the 90% margin of error for the estimates. If the vertical lines touch the 0 line, we can't be certain there was an undercount or an overcount. The 1990 census undercounted the population. The 2000 census overcounted the population. The 2010 and 2020 census did not have a statistically significant overall undercount or overcount. Here we see the next slide. Here we see the net coverage error rates by race and Hispanic origin. Except for the non-Hispanic white alone, all rows show race alone or in combination. For the 2020 census, the PES estimated undercounts for the groups Black or African Americans, American Indian or Alaska Native, some other race, and Hispanic or Latino. Overcounts were estimated for white, non-Hispanic white alone, and Asian. Next slide. For the most part, the demographic analysis and the PES agree on which age sex groups were undercounted and which were overcounted, even though the specific estimates are not always the same. In the past, demographic analysis and the PES have not always agreed. For the 2020 census, there's considerable agreement in terms of which groups were undercounted and which were overcounted. Next slide. Consistent with prior censuses, the 2020 census overcounted homeowners and undercounted renters. The 2000, 2010, and 2020 census also showed overcounts of homeowners and undercounts for renters. Thank you very much. That's all I have to present today, but I will encourage you to read the press release and blogs from the Census Bureau on the Post-Enumeration Survey findings. And please stay tuned for more PES coverage estimates in May and later on in the summer. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Tim. That was pretty great. I want to ask a question I probably know the answer to, and that is, do these estimates in any way, shape, or form change the data that's been provided to the states for any purposes, for policy purposes or for redistricting purposes? Do these change the data, or these just are on the edges of the data?
These did not change the census counts and the census results that have been released. So there's no new release or adjustment based on the census. The Supreme Court had a ruling around the 2000 census time period saying we could not adjust the census for apportionment reasons, for allocating the seats in the House of Representatives, and we're not adjusting any of the census numbers. Now, there are other estimates using the census and building on them and combining other sources like population estimates, and that's a different question altogether, and I'm not the right person to talk about those estimates. But they are exploring how we can incorporate, the post-enumeration survey and demographic analysis better into those population estimates. So that's an area of research at this point.
Great. Thank you, Tim. I want to say to my colleague, Christy, that she's got behind the scenes a side-by-side comparison of the post-enumeration survey and the demographic analysis. So if any of you want to see her quick table on that, send her an email and she'll share that out. Terry, we're up for you. Would you please start with your first contact with the census?
Sure. So as many of you know, after 72 years, the census records get released by the National Archives. And so in April of this year, the 1950 census was released. And my son is an urban planner in Austin, Texas, and he could hardly wait to get to the computer and find out about me and his grandparents. And so he sent me the page. And of course, I knew about my parents, and I wasn't very interesting. I was 9 months old. And so, you know, no schooling completed, no income, no education, nothing like that. But what was fascinating to me was the apartment building in which my parents lived. They were the only people born in the United States. Everybody else had been born in Italy. And I thought that was really remarkable. You know, coming from a strong Irish Catholic background, I could never figure out why my mother made such good spaghetti. I think now I know. I think she learned it from her neighbors back in that apartment building. So I did learn something from that. And I will say that, you know, my son also did his father, you know, so we got caught up on what happened back in 1950. And for those of you who are interested, it is pretty interesting to do. Oops, you're muted, Wendy.
I was trying to do the right thing, but I did the wrong thing. So take it away. Tell us about the panel.
Sure, be happy to. So let's see, let me see if I can share my screen here. Oh, there we go. So as you heard, I'm Teresa Sullivan. I am with the University of Virginia, but the reason I'm here is because of my role on the panel on the accuracy of the 2020 census. So many of you understand why we take a census, but I always explain this to my classes because they often don't realize that it is constitutional. And that is because that's how we determine the numbers of people from each state in the House of Representatives. The first census in the US was in 1790, and that year, the census date was August 2nd. And the census was overseen by Secretary of State Thomas Jefferson. We pay a lot of attention to him here because he founded the University of Virginia. And there were 3.9 million people counted. Both President Washington and Secretary of State Jefferson thought this was an undercount. And to reduce the possibility of undercount in 1790, they did something we would never do today. They posted the results for public inspection in two prominent places in each district. And that's sort of what it looked like. So if you thought you hadn't been counted, you could actually check directly and see if you had been counted or not. Madison was a member of Congress at that point, and he had proposed a much more elaborate census than our first one. He thought you should get data on occupation and other economic information. And Congress did not go along with it in 1790, but later on they did. And so many questions were added to the decennial censuses depending upon the needs of the population. So today, this is the nation's largest peacetime operation. The estimated cost for 2020 was $14.2 billion. It mobilized a small army of temporary workers. It continued the Census Bureau's history of technological innovation, and the Census Bureau has been a leader in that. Today, the Census Bureau is located in the U.S. Department of Commerce. That wasn't always true. And the conditions under which they did the 2020 census is also something I want to talk about a little bit. I told you the census is used to apportion the House of Representatives and also the Electoral College at the same time. But in fiscal year 2017, there were 316 federal spending programs that relied on census data one way or another, somewhere in a formula, to distribute $1.5 trillion. And this money went to state and local governments, nonprofits, some businesses, school districts, some households. This was 7.8% of the gross domestic product, which is a lot of money. And this research was done by Andrew Reamer from George Washington University. So this panel is an independent assessment of census quality. We were sponsored by the US Census Bureau because the Bureau is committed to continuously improving. That is why they do the post-enumeration survey, the demographic analysis Tim just told you about. Our panel works through both public meetings that are open to anybody and deliberative meetings that are closed. We will produce freely available reports. We're scheduled to complete our work in May of 2023, which is a bit of a problem because a lot of the data we'd like to use will apparently not be released in time for us to use it. Our first report, however, is available for free. You can get it from the National Academies Press. It has this kind of uninspiring cover to it, but it is free. And I think that you will find that it has at least some interesting information. This panel is made up of 14 experts. We have state and local demography, including some state demographers. We have statisticians. We have a famed census historian. We have quite a few social scientists and a Canadian census expert. And as Wendy mentioned, we have Wendy. And I guess I'm chairing it because I wrote this book. So in every census, there are quality indicators that you can look at. And one reason you do this is not to criticize what's already happened. You can do that, but that's not very worthwhile. Instead, it's to make sure that you are improving the caliber of the next census. So a lot of what we're doing is looking ahead to 2030. So some of the indicators include the adequacy of coverage. So you've just heard Tim talk about that, for example. We also look at the success of various census operations. You know, the development of the address list, how non-response follow-up went on. So if you have a housing unit that has not responded to the census, non-response follow-up is that procedure by which people try to go back to that house and get information from the people in it, or failing that, get proxy information. And then in general, we want the quality of the information. Did people refuse to answer some questions? How much did we have to impute missing information? How many households did we miss altogether? But 2020 was a census year like no other. And this fire is not metaphorical. Because of COVID, the census data collection got delayed. Normally, April 1st is not forest fire season. It's not hurricane season. But non-response follow-up went on through the summer and into the fall. And on the West Coast, there were forest fires that forced people to leave their homes. And of course, that makes follow-up on enumeration much more difficult to do. There were 2 hurricanes that struck within a week of each other in Louisiana, and that interrupted non-response follow-up in Louisiana. And then, of course, there was COVID. And maybe COVID came at the worst possible time. You will recall the country generally shut down around March 15th of 2020. The census date was April 1st. The timing really couldn't have been worse. And this was particularly true for places such as colleges and universities who largely sent their students home. Those students should have been counted in their college towns, but it appears a lot of them were not, because they came back home, their parents were filling out the form, they said, oh yeah, Jimmy's here, Janice is here, we're gonna put them in our form as well. Because of COVID and also all these other things, there was a delay in the count, and there's been a substantial delay in the completion of non-response follow-up. So these quality assessments are not occurring as quickly as they did after the 2010 census. And that's frustrating for people like us who are trying to assess the quality. But I want to emphasize, it's not really anybody's fault. There's no conspiracy going on here. It's just that COVID messed everything up. So these are the initial conclusions that our panel put in that interim document that I showed you a slide for a few minutes ago. Our first conclusion is that we commended the Census Bureau for producing the census under such difficult circumstances. You can imagine people just throwing up their hands and saying, we can't even do this. But that's not what they did. They worked really hard. They tried new things. And I think much of what we've learned from there will be helpful in 2030. Conclusion 2 was that one of the reasons for the success in 2020, even though things happened that weren't planned for, was that there had been a robust planning process. So some of the things that had been done in the planning process was to increase automation in the field collection, make more use of administrative records. For example, if you've got that household that only gives you a couple of names or doesn't give you any names at all, modernizing the address list development. So among other things, that involved using satellite imagery. And maybe most importantly, letting people respond by internet. And just about 2/3 of the American population did respond by internet. And that was a huge saving grace for non-response follow-up because it meant lots of people were already counted. Conclusion 3, however, and this may sound like a bit of a wet blanket, but just because it was successfully completed does not mean that the data is of high quality and that it's accurate. That remains to be seen. And we say that just to, warn people that you can complete the census, but, you may not be happy with the quality of the data. Conclusion 4 was, as I've already mentioned, the Census Bureau labored under many formidable challenges, disruptions, and impediments. And a lot of them were beyond their control. They couldn't control COVID, they couldn't control forest fires, they couldn't control hurricanes. But some of the disruptions arose from design decisions that had been made by the Census Bureau. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about one of those. It is called differential privacy. Now, you remember back in 1790, they just go and they nail the census enumeration on the courthouse door. We don't do that anymore. In fact, people are so concerned about privacy that the Census Bureau goes to great lengths to assure people that their data will be kept both private and confidential. But we now live in a world where there's lots of data out there everywhere in social media, from credit card companies, from all sorts of people. And they generate databases that can be cross-classified with each other and used to go back and identify somebody in the census. The Bureau did a test between 2010 and 2020 to see if a person using these external data sources could re-identify people in the census. And they found to an unacceptable degree it was possible to do. So therefore, the Census Bureau looked for a new way of avoiding disclosure of confidential data. The method they used is called differential privacy. And this is a document from the Bureau that helps to explain it. I'm going to do my own effort to try and explain it to you now, and we'll see. I don't pretend to perfectly understand it, but I think I can give you a high-level understanding of it. So suppose this is our original national database. There's lots of people in it you can see, but you can also see pretty clearly who this lady is. And we know from her census record how old this lady is. She is 37 years old. Well, that's not good. We don't want people to know that she's 37. And so we blur the data. And we say she's between 36 and 38. And now with the blurred data in the same photo, you can't really pick her out anymore. Well, statistically, that's called adding noise. And so adding noise is how differential privacy works to try and preserve the privacy of people who responded to the census. Now, unfortunately, it can be shown that there is a trade-off between having accurate data and having private data. So down here, where you have completely private data, you don't have any accuracy. Up here, where you have complete accuracy, you don't have any privacy. So somewhere on this trade-off horizon, the Census Bureau has to figure out where they're going to draw the line for the trade-off between accuracy and privacy loss. And as you can probably guess, lots of people will not be happy with where they draw it, no matter where they draw it. By the way, differential privacy is not used only by the Census Bureau. It's used by a number of high-tech companies. Microsoft uses it, Google uses it. So, it's not an unknown method of handling data privacy. I want to talk about one more thing, which is the CQR process. So we're going to be talking, Bill's going to talk a lot about undercount, I think. So, you may have questions about undercount in your state or locality. And you should know that the census count question resolution process is now open. And what they will review is boundaries. If you think, say, the city limits had moved and that didn't get accounted for, and housing counts. If you believe, for example, that there was a new housing development that didn't get enumerated. I'm just giving that as an example. There are other things too. The filing deadline is going to be June 30th of 2023. So you have more than a year to do it. You can find answers to your questions about this on the Census Bureau website. And they give you, quite a lot of information about it if your state or locality is interested in pursuing the issue. When I checked earlier this week, this was some of the cases that had been received already. Some of them from pretty small towns and from tribal areas, one from the entire state of Wisconsin. So what if you have other concerns about how the census handled your locality? Well, the first piece of advice I would give you is talk to your state demographer. Your state demographer knows so many things and is very willing to have a conversation with you about what they've learned. Check in with the local school district superintendent or with your state organization of school superintendents. They worry a lot about the undercount of children because it makes it hard to project how many children will be starting kindergarten or first grade if they've been undercounted. And then finally, another group that is very interested in what's happening with census data would be the advocacy organizations for minority groups and for what the Bureau calls hard to count groups. So an example of a hard to count group would be people who are experiencing homelessness. So I'm going to stop there and let you go on and maybe have some questions.
Great. Thanks very much, Terry. And I love that you started back with history. Everything makes more sense if you know where the starting point is. On the complete count resolution, is it true that that does make a difference in the numbers that relate to the funding that comes out to the states and localities?
I would say it could. It's not guaranteed, but it will not have any effect on apportionment or redistricting because those have been done already.
Got it.
There will not be an effort to go back and do that, but it could have an impact on funding. And
So
also,
it might be,
well, that depends to some extent too on Congress's cooperation with this.
okay, that makes me want to ask some more questions, but we'll get to that some other time. But it sounds like if you are related to a local jurisdiction, it's worth your while perhaps to do what those folks have already done that you showed that slide, because maybe they think it's not just about having nice data, it's about having accurate funding coming to them over the next 9 years or so.
And you know, maybe the two parts of the community that are most concerned about that would be your healthcare community and your school community.
And may I just say that state budgets tend to be a lot about education and a lot about health. Thank you very much. Bill, tell us how you got started with census and then take it away.
Thanks. So first of all, thanks for allowing me to be here. Appreciate the opportunity. I don't know if getting started is quite the way to put it, but I recall in 1960, my mother was an enumerator in the 1960 census. And in the mid-Michigan area where we lived in the spring, you can either know or can imagine a lot of muddy roads. One of my memories of her situation was calling home more than once because she got stuck in a muddy road trying to reach some farmhouse in rural Michigan. And to add to that story, when I was she passed away about 15 years ago. I was going through her effects. I found her enumerator badge from the 1960 census, which I typically carry around with me when I go to meetings these days. So that was kind of my first exposure to the census. And as I got more involved as a professional later in life, it kind of gave me a little flavor of how this data is really collected as opposed to a more sterile vision that we sometimes have. So let me talk about when I see let me first say that when I see the kind of data that Timothy was talking about and other data from the census, it tells me a story. And that's a story I want to share with you over the next 10 minutes or so. And the name I give that story is A Tale of Two Censuses. And I think you'll see what I mean by that very soon. But before I get into the story, let me just make 3 points, if I could, about assessing census accuracy. The first point is that net coverage of the overall population really isn't a very good measure for us to use in assessing a census because it masks a couple of things. First, it's a net figure, so it masks different overcounts and undercounts, which can erase each other. The other is it masks differences across groups. And that's the second point that I want to make here, is that in my mind, the most important way to assess the quality or accuracy of a census is in the differential undercounts or differential accuracy across groups. That census that has smaller differences across groups and accuracy is a better census than a census that has more differences across groups. And I think that brings in another concept of equity within a census. That is a census fair if some groups are missed disproportionately and some groups are double counted disproportionately? And I think we don't spend as much time talking about equity as we do about accuracy. So there's 2 points there. The third point I want to make is the statement, I guess, that net undercounts are not the same as people missed. I know it's an easy mistake for people to make, particularly those who don't use census data much. But as I said earlier, net undercounts are a balance between people missed on the one hand and people double counted on the other. So if you miss a lot of people and you double count a lot of people, the net undercounts look like zero. So so that's the point. One point I want to make. Let me go to the next slide. Let me kind of make that point a little different way by talking about 3 different views of the census using census data. I think all of this was in Tim's presentation, or most of it. If you look at the net undercount in the 2020 census, it's about 800,000 people, which is about 0.25%. And that's pretty consistent with the last couple censuses and pretty good by historical or international standards. So from that measure of accuracy, the 2020 census looks pretty good. The second piece of information is what the Census Bureau calls emissions, and there was almost 19 million of those in the 2020 census, which amounts to 5.8%. So from that perspective, the census doesn't look quite as good. It doesn't look nearly as good as the net undercount figure. And the third point is if you look at omissions as a mistake and the people double counted and counted erroneously and imputed as other kinds of mistakes and put all those errors together, you get about 37 million people. That's about 11% of the population. So all of these statistics, I think, are correct. They're from the Census Bureau, and I think they're reasonably good, but they give you very different perceptions of the quality of the 2020 census. So I just wanted to kind of cover that ground too before I get into the story. So as I said, when I look at the data from the census, I get a story, and I call that story the tale of 2 censuses. And in that conception, I think of 2 different groups. I could call them the haves and the have-nots, but to try and convince you that I'm a real scholar, I called them mainstream and marginalized. Sounds a little better, I guess. But you can see the characteristics of the people I call mainstream, and I think you could add some stuff to that. I think most people have a conception of what that group looks like. And the other group, marginalized, mostly don't have those things or have some other things like lack of public trust. And you can easily imagine the groups in the marginalized population of the country. So as I go through some data now, I think you'll see these 2 kinds of populations pop out time and again. I'll start with when the census was being conducted. And in this last census, the Bureau provided daily response rates by census tract. And response rates are in many ways an indirect measure of quality. The higher the response rate for a group or an area, the more likely it is to have a more accurate census count. And so I worked with someone else. We put these census tract data, sorted them by the majority population in the census tract, and then calculated the mean response rate for those kinds of tracts. To be a little clearer, the 73% over the Asian alone column means the census tracts where Asians were the majority of the population had a mean response rate of 73%. The census tracts where non-Hispanic whites were the majority of the population had a mean response rate of 70%. The total across the country is 67%. If we look at tracts where Hispanics were the majority of the population, the mean response rate was 60%, and for Blacks it was 56%. So I think this, during the census taking process, we get a glimpse of what the results were likely to look like when we got the results in. So let me look at those results. This is a bar chart that shows net coverage by race and Hispanic origin. The bars that go down from 0 are net undercounts. The bars that go up from 0 axis are net overcounts. And just to capsulize what's in here, you can see non-Hispanic white alone and Asians both had net undercounts, 1.6% and 2.6%. On the other hand, Blacks and American Indians on reservation and Hispanics had high net undercounts. So that kind of in many ways reflects the response rates we saw on the first slide. It also talks about different experiences of different groups, basically mainstream and marginalized groups, in terms of how the 2020 census covered them in terms of accuracy. Just to look at capsulized change between 2010 and 2020, the net undercount of non-Hispanic whites doubled. So for non-Hispanic whites, I can't say it's a better census, I guess, because their error increased, but it increased in a positive direction for them. Likewise for Asians. On the other hand, for Blacks and Hispanics, there were increases in the net undercount for those two groups. So the census got worse for those two groups when you compare 2020 to 2010 in terms of coverage measurement. I mentioned earlier that net undercounts are not the same as omissions. This is a chart that shows the omission rates for these different groups, very similar to the undercount. The pattern is very similar in that non-Hispanic, white alone, and Asians had relatively low omission rates, and Black and Hispanics and American Indian reservations had relatively high omission rates. So it tells the same story that these groups, the Black, Hispanic, and American Indian reservations had much higher omission rates than other groups. And so again, the census experience was very different for those groups. Very similar to the previous couple of slides, that the omission rates for non-Hispanic, white, Asians decreased between 2010 and 2020. So things got better in many ways. On the other hand, omission rates for Black and Hispanics got worse from 2010 to 2020. And again, a reflection in my mind of the difference between mainstream and marginalized population and how they experienced the 2020 census. Let me change the focus a little bit and talk about another group that is dear to my heart, I guess, and I think is marginalized in a little different way, and that's young children. So this slide looks at net undercount rates and overcount rates, net coverage rates by 5-year age groups along the bottom. And again, the bars that go up from 0 are net overcounts, and the bars that go down from 0 are net undercounts. And if you focus on the far left-hand side of this chart, you'll see a bar that goes down to 5.4. That is the net undercount rate for young children, age 0 to 4, in the 2020 census. You can see that it's much higher than any other age group, and that very few, well, I guess we should have started a little, there's a lot of differences across the age groups in terms of overcounts and undercounts. So again, the net figure for the total population doesn't reflect those differences, but one of the major differences is the net undercount of young children. And I want to present one more slide on this to put this in a little bigger context for young children. This is the net coverage rate for adults in the blue line and young children 0 to 4 in the gray dotted line from 1950 to 2020. And you can see between 1950 and 1980, there was very little difference between the coverage rate for those two groups, and both were improving. After 1980, it's a very different story. The improvement for adults continued to the point that it had very little coverage error in 2000, 2010, and 2020. On the other hand, for young children, the net undercount rate went down every year between 1980 and 2020, to the point that it reached 5.4% in 2020, which I'll note is even higher than it was in 1950. So one way to talk about this is the fact that the coverage rate for young children is worse now than it was 70 years ago. And the main point I want to make here is that the undercount of young children is a big problem, and it's a growing problem. And I think it's important for us to focus on that for the 2030 census. This is from 2010, but I just want to highlight one other aspect of this. I think it's important. This is data by age and race. The red dotted line is for Black males, and you can see on the legend the other groups. But the point is, Black males are very different than the other groups in terms of census coverage. And for Black males in the 20 to 50-year-old age range, there has been and is a very high net undercount for that group. So it's another marginalized group, I think, where the census experience is quite different than the mainstream group. So Tim already talked about the data. I just will note that we still don't have data for Black young children and Hispanic young children 0 to 4, and we won't get that until the Bureau produces what they call a modified race file, which will probably not come out till the demographic and housing characteristics file is issued, which now is going to be of May of 2023. I just learned yesterday or day before. And so it's a little bit frustrating that we won't have these kind of key data for the undercount of young minority children for another year or so. So let me just say the conclusions and I'll wrap up here. I hope it's probably obvious that the 2020 census was better than the 2020 census for some groups, but worse for other groups. And it's basically a have and a have not kind of distinction. And secondly, in preparing for the 2030 census, I think the Census Bureau needs to focus more on the groups with high net undercounts, the basically have-nots or marginalized population. So let me stop there. I'd be happy to, there's my contact information, happy to talk to anybody anytime about this. Thank you.
Well, super great, Bill. Thank you very much. You certainly know how to spell things out in understandable units. So I really love that. I guess it tells me that you've done it once or twice before. Christy and I behind the scenes were asking ourselves, and so we're going to ask you, why is it that kids are so hard to count? We're a little mystified by why it is that 0 to 4 get lost.
It is a bit of a mystery, and two things I'll mention. One is that there's been almost no research on this until the last 5 years or so, when the Census Bureau and some other people have kind of picked it up. The biggest factor in my mind, well, there's several factors. The biggest factor in my mind is a survey. It relates to a survey that we conducted from the Count All Kids Initiative in 2019, which found that 10% of parents of young children didn't think young children were supposed to be included in the census. They didn't see why the government needed to know about them. They're not in school. So 10% didn't think were not planning to include their young child in the census for that reason. Another 8% of those respondents were not sure whether they would include their young child or not. And you can imagine that's almost a fifth of the population of parents of young children are doubtful about whether they will include their young child or not. And you can understand easily, I guess, why we have such a high net undercount of young children. But I also think it highlights the need for education, communication, and maybe better instructions on the census form so that people understand young children are supposed to be included.
Would you say that means that we need more education that kids count?
Yes.
Okay, we've got a couple of questions about differential privacy. I'm going to come. The first one I'm going to do is going to be for you, Tim, and the second one will be for Teresa. So Tim, is differential privacy applied to the post-enumeration survey?
It was not. If you look at that very beginning equation I showed where the census count minus the PES estimate, we're using a rounded census number. That's the raw number before differential privacy has been applied. I believe demographic analysis is using the differentially private census number. So there's some difference in whether you're using the PES or the demographic analysis, how we handle differential privacy.
Okay, great.
The PES is measuring the coverage of the quality or the coverage of the census, in its relatively raw form. It's been edited, but it's not gone through the disclosure avoidance formal privacy protections.
All right, this next question, Terry, I'm going to ask you to take a first stab at it. It's related to what we just heard. Does differential privacy complicate or affect the analyses of census quality at all, especially for counts below the state level? Is the comparison of post-enumeration survey and demographic analysis to the raw census data, the data after differential privacy, or both? So I think we're getting at the same thing with just a little bit more meat on the bones.
Well, let me take a stab at it. For those of you who are interested, the New York Times last Friday ran a story about differential privacy in which they reported 15 people being counted as living under the Chicago River. Well, it's not really possible, but differential privacy ends up doing kind of mischievous things. I mean, I would say in general, you can rely on higher levels of aggregation as being accurate. But by higher levels, I mean like at the state. The lower you get down in census geography, the more the noise is likely to affect your conclusions. So the Bureau itself warns, census blocks are not to be used unless they're aggregated up into bigger geographies. So you're probably going to find the greatest distortion at the census block level. I also see that there's a question here about is there any recourse for this? Well, I think that's why the CQR process is going to be important. And, again, I can't guarantee that you'll put in the effort and you'll get the result you want. But if you don't put in the effort, you for sure won't get the result you want.
Good point. We also have a question, and this one is for you, Bill, about the accuracy of the 2020 census data for rural areas.
It's a good
and
question.
While you're on rural, also think about differential privacy for rural areas.
Well, I wrote a piece on census and rural areas for the Carsey Institute in University of New Hampshire a couple of years ago. So there's a lot more detail about that, my thinking on that there. The bottom line for me is that in general, rural areas are counted more accurately, but there's several what I call hotspots, I guess, where it's not counted more accurately. Things like Appalachia, Black communities in the rural South, Indian reservations, and a few other places like that, where there are clearly some trouble spots, for lack of a better word. So the accuracy for rural areas is a little more hit or miss, I guess I would say.
Got it. Okay, so that's interesting that again, you've got two tale of at least two rural possibilities. We are coming up close to the end. So what I think I'd like to do is ask each of our panelists what they would like to suggest for policymakers, and that is to say lawmakers, but it could also be people in the executive branch who are using this data. What should they do so that they're using the data at their highest level, or what is important that they know as they go about their work? Tim, I'm going to start with you, and then Terry, and then Bill. That wasn't very nice. Yeah, Terry, I know you can do this first. Terry, Tim, and then Bill.
Oh, I'm going to start, huh? Okay. Well, what I would say is, pay attention to what's being released from the Census Bureau, because it makes a big difference to localities and states. And, if you are concerned about differential privacy, they're putting a lot of information on the website that will help you. So I noticed that Terry Ann Lowenthal mentioned that the people under the Chicago River were a geocoding problem. That's probably right, but if you kept reading the story, you read a lot about census blocks that had only children under 18 and no adults. We call those Lord of the Flies blocks. and that is directly a result of injecting noise. But if you aggregate those blocks into higher levels of geography, you're going to end up getting a much more accurate number.
Sorry, Terry, I think Wendy's power went out. So thank you. Bill, we'll go
Well,
to
let me
you
say
next.
something quick that I know we're running out of time, but a little farther down the road, but Title 13 is the legislation or the law that guides how the Census Bureau needs to protect about confidentiality and privacy. And I think it was written in a long time ago and is not really up to date in terms of modern statistical techniques and the whole re-identification system. I think Congress should revisit Title 13, not only for the Census Bureau, but for other agencies, I guess, to give them a little more liberty in how they address that issue than the current law specifies.
Great. Thanks, Bill. Tim?
I'll just say that the Census Bureau wants a partnership and build stronger partnerships with the states. And we want to hear back, feedback from everybody and work with communities, at the ground level, at state level, every level. We really want a partnership with everybody. And, we want to hear how things are going for you, what we can do better. So we're very open and happy to partnership and make the 2030 census the best ever. And also we want to hear how we, what you're finding in the 2020 data, what you like about it, what you wish were different, and how we can do a better job. We're continuously measuring what we've done well, what we haven't done well, and thinking about what we can do better. And we're happy to have as much feedback as possible.
Well, thank you, Tim. I know that NCSL has been very fortunate to have a great partnership with the Bureau, and you have been instrumental prior to the census and afterwards to being available to us and our members. So thank you. We are at the top of the hour, so I want to give a wonderful thank you to our speakers, to Terry, Bill, and Tim. You guys are fantastic. You're the experts, and we were so thankful that you were able to participate today. And we do plan to have more census webinars coming down the pipeline, and hopefully we can work with you again. So I'm just let everybody know, thank you for participating and attending today. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to myself or Wendy if you have any questions. So with that, I just want to sort of sign off and I hope everyone has a wonderful day.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Here.